Listen, I'm gonna be honest. Giorno Giovanna is my favorite fictional character, and there is not a drop of irony in this video's title. I'm releasing this right before Part 5's epilogue and expect spoilers for everything prior to this point. I'll make a few vague references to Part 6, but am mostly sticking with what's been animated, no major spoilers beyond Vento Aureo. Other than Jotaro, every JoJo was my favorite during their respective part. Over and over I told myself, this is the protagonist who is simply too great to ever lose that title, only to see Araki top himself. But Giorno was something special, and I do not see him going anywhere. The question of what would happen if Dio used Jonathan's body to have sex is something you would ask yourself drunk on a Thursday morning. But not only did Araki take the question dead seriously, he hammered it into pure gold. I love that Giorno literally has two fathers and inherited traits from both bloodlines. I love that the first JoJo to be a consummate twink is also a ruthless gangster. I love the simplicity of his backstory and how the turning point was just learning to trust people. I love that he hangs out with Koichi and fights a stand called Black Sabbath. And I love that his hair is both stupid and the coolest thing I have ever seen. Don't worry, this video isn't just a bunch of sentences, but there is just so much to like about Giorno. Let's start with his design. The hair, the ladybugs, and the heart are all elements that could be cringy on their own, but they combine into something which emphasizes his separation from the other Joestars while still matching the larger aesthetic. And while I have to concede that Josuke's anime depiction is objectively the best one, Giorno's look is exactly what it needs to be, even looking badass in pink and green. A choice I did not believe in at all until seeing the first episode. Gold Experience's look is more of a mixed bag. I like the sleek design and references to Dio, but could live without the bicycle helmet or giant perforated codpiece. I get that Araki couldn't pull the usual trick of tweaking Star Platinum, but sitting between Crazy Diamond and Stone Free, it just doesn't hold up. And even inside its own part, it gets overshadowed hard by Sex Pistols and Aerosmith. Its Requiem form is actually ugly, but seeing a stand take charge and beat the enemy on its own more than made up for it. That said, Giorno's power set is easily my favorite among the JoJos. I was a massive fan of Haman, and one of my biggest complaints with this series was how unceremoniously it was abandoned after Battle Tendency. Throughout Part 3, I kept waiting for that scene, where Dio would break out a unit of vampires who were resistant to stand attacks, and Joseph would have to use his Haman again, walking on water, running up walls, and generally showing the younger Crusaders how strong he really was. Needless to say, that never happened, and seeing the influence of Haman in Giorno's abilities gave me a satisfaction I had long given up on. Even better, his powers centered around manipulating life and making plants grow, something I can never get enough of, and it was the aspect of Haman which I always thought was most underused in the early parts. And this sense of Giorno somehow fixing my problems with early JoJo became a running theme in my affection for him. I always felt cheated by the end of Phantom Blood. I understand the narrative reasons behind Jonathan's death, but it seemed wrong for such a lovable protagonist to die in the 10th episode. We did get to see Dio back in Part 3, but his interactions with the Crusaders never really matched the intensity of his grudge with Jonathan. This brutally personal conflict between brothers was just a classic pairing, and it's what made Phantom Blood. And to the extent that Part 1 holds up, it's because of this relationship, with JoJo's success as a series resting squarely on Dio's behavior in the early chapters. By the time of Vento Aureo, it was like the series had forgotten its roots. The last character to have known someone who knew Jonathan had gone senile, and the antagonists were only tangentially connected to Dio, who had been dead for years at that point. And while this was also true of Part 4, having two Crusaders in Morio gave us a sense of continuity that a Koichi cameo just can't match, as much as I enjoyed it. Through Giorno, Araki brought Phantom Blood back into relevance, letting the corny, old-fashioned origins of JoJo take center stage in the part least connected to the series as a whole, and it finally gave me the closure which I couldn't get from Episode 10. Not only does Giorno keep the legacy of his fathers alive simply by existing, but he also carries on the conflict between them in that we can see the influence of both fighting in his personality. Giorno is kind, but kills without hesitation. He's socially conscious with a massive personal ambition. His actions are rooted in a deep code of ethics, but always allow for the practical realities. And brilliantly, this struggle over Giorno's soul finds a sort of resolution because despite these contradictions, these mismatched traits do gel together into a personality that is not only stable but pretty effective. Giorno has an incredible ability to just get things done. And if I had to pick one JoJo to get me through a bad situation, it would be him, hands down. With the other candidates being, in order, too nice, a reckless dipshit, terrible at communication, a dumb teenager, and too nice again. Giorno has the empathy to win over a big sweetheart like Bruno, and a reserved charisma which lets him seamlessly slide into the squad. But when facing a man like Cioccolata, he can be just as cunning and brutal as Dio ever was, efficiently removing a threat which was simply too dangerous to fool around with. When Araki wrote Phantom Blood, it's like he was asking, how should someone react to unfair circumstances? With the main characters being these two different answers, one embodying unconditional generosity and the other unchecked ambition. Both became incredible men in their own way, but neither could solve all their problems or achieve a lasting victory. Dio sacrifices his humanity to kill Jonathan, who sacrifices his life to kill Dio, who survives into the future through his powers but gets killed by Jonathan's descendants, who then fight the scattered remnants of Dio's organization. It's like the original JoJo universe is framed by these parallel legacies which are destined to clash forever. That is, until we get to Giorno, who takes the unconditional self-sacrifice of Jonathan and the self-empowerment of Dio and combines them into his own philosophy of dreams. For all that they accomplished, neither of Giorno's fathers was ever really good at defining a goal. With Dio just instinctively amassing power and Jonathan trying to stop Dio from instinctively amassing power. Giorno's dream is different. He has a vision of the world as it should be, and he uses that to set his direction. His end goal is incredibly difficult, but also practical and grounded in reality. Fulfilling it would put him in a position of power, but it would also improve the lives of everyone around him. He isn't just giving or taking. He's grabbing everyone who will listen and helping them move towards something worthwhile. I love that, other than Jonathan, Giorno is probably the only JoJo who could actually explain his morality. But, unlike Jonathan, you could never really use Giorno's morals against him. If you pulled a bystander into a fight, their welfare would absolutely be a goal for Giorno. But he wouldn't let the possibility of collateral damage deter him from fighting in the first place. Nor could you stop him by taking a human shield. If you did, he would probably find a way around it and save everybody. But there's always the assumption that, while we should always strive for the best possible outcome, at the end of the day, we need to solve the problem and we need to win. Thanks in advance for humoring this, but this actually reminds me of an old story about two philosophers who were arguing about human nature. One said that humans were naturally good. The other said that humans were malleable and free-flowing, like water. Then the first said, yes, that's true, but pointed out that water doesn't flow anywhere, it always flows down. Giorno doesn't have a list of rules he has to follow, but he has a direction to push towards. He knows how life could be better, he knows how life could be worse, and while the details can get pretty ugly, as long as him and his friend are moving towards the dream, everything is as it should be. JoJo's has never been a series to fixate on ideas, but not only did we get a real answer to the moral questions from the story's origins, it came in the form of the creepy, half-vampire monster child who was fathered by both of the original main characters. And that will never stop being amazing to me. An aspect of Giorno which is harder to appreciate is his structural role in the story and questionable status as protagonist. I understand why people struggle with this, but I think it serves a larger purpose which does make it worthwhile. Satisfying character arcs have always been hit or miss in Araki's writing. Dio and Jonathan actually changed quite a bit, but it was almost all front-loaded into the first few chapters, and after that, the big emotional moments tend to happen between characters rather than inside them. Joseph's relationships with Wham and Caesar far outshine his personal growth. The Crusaders are hardly worth mentioning, although Jotaro and Polnareff do show some changes when they reappear in later parts. And as wonderful as the characters in Part 4 are, their charm comes from playing off of each other in interesting ways, not personal growth. The one exception being Koichi, who probably has the best arc in the whole series. Speaking of which, I think it's significant that the most satisfying progression came from one of the few stand users who had to develop their power. I also doubt it's a coincidence that the part which first introduced stands suffers from some of the most underwritten characters. Yet another unsung benefit of Hamen was that it was essentially a martial art, and it lent itself to training sequences which would display the growth of the protagonists. And I suspect that the limited character progression in parts 3 and 4 were the result of the delay between Araki swapping power systems and learning new ways to show personal growth. By the time of Vento Aureo, Araki had totally overcome this, writing so many arcs that even the antagonists get in on it. It seems like every important character has some emotional hang-up that gets some sort of resolution. They don't all learn the right lesson, but each comes to terms with their own weaknesses and makes a choice. Though it might be the last thing they do. Or even come after that. Weirdly enough, the only person without any transformation seems to be the protagonist. But that's not actually true. Like every member of Bruno's squad, Giorno was horribly wronged and lost his sense of place, but unlike the other guys, he actually found an answer. Giorno's encounter with the mysterious gangster didn't just teach him to trust people. It showed him that life can be better, and what type of person can make that happen. It gave him a hero, which then let him decide what kind of man he wanted to grow into. This all culminated in Giorno crafting his dream, after which he had basically become a mature character. In his heart, Giorno has already become the Don of Passion. It's just a matter of helping everyone else catch up to this reality. Much like Jotaro in Part 4, the key events of Giorno's life have already happened, and while this doesn't allow him to have an arc of his own, it lets him be a source of support for the characters who are still struggling. It's kind of like Araki inverts the structure of the traditional hero story, having the main character be a stable, finished product, while the party that forms around him split protagonist duty and have their smaller arcs in parallel. Giorno has figured out who he is as a person, and his dream becomes this framework that the other characters are pulled into, either directly or through his influence on Bruno, and it adds so much more meaning and emotional weight to the choices each squad member makes that I'm more than happy to sacrifice the personal growth that Giorno would have had in a more conventional story. This is a good point to address one of the big criticisms with Giorno which I completely disagree with, that Giorno is a Mary Sue. First off, maybe I'm crazy, but I don't see how you can be a brutal anti-hero and a Mary Sue. Why not just call Griffith a Mary Sue? Because before the eclipse, they're practically the same character. More importantly, a Mary Sue isn't just an overly perfect character, it's a character who is overly perfect relative to their role in the story. As an example, let's take Kakashi from early Naruto. He can use several types of chakra, is absurdly strong, and can copy any other ninja's abilities because of a genetic trait from a family he doesn't belong to, which is explained through an absurdly tragic backstory. Guy and all the other team heads aren't that far behind, and the third Hokage has explicitly mastered every single jutsu native to his village. None of this bothers us because these characters aren't Mary Sues. They're adults, with life histories and social positions which match their other qualities. If Giorno was a conventional shonen protagonist whose arc deals with growing up and becoming an individual, I would agree that his improbable maturity and drive to succeed would be a problem. But his actual role in the story is more like Gandalf was to the Hobbits, or All Might with Class 1A. A somewhat distant figure who has already been through this stuff and should be judged by his ability to facilitate the growth of others, rather than grow himself. Yes, Giorno is 15, and I have no way of making that make sense. JoJo ages were always arbitrary, but Vento Aureo is where Araki seems to have done things by setting a random number generator to less than 20 and just spamming the button. Also, Giorno is relatively weak, being the first JoJo to be a below-average member of his team. Yes, Araki did nerf Gold Experience, and Rohan was omnipotent. But the fact remains that Giorno has to borrow the strength of other people in a way that Jotaro and Josuke simply did not. And there's a genuine humility in this which makes his Mary Sue moments much more tolerable. The sun breaking behind Giorno as he gave a speech about dreams was pretty heavy-handed, and I understand why this could come across as Araki overselling us on how great his main character is. But this is not Giorno's victory, it's Mista's. Mista is the one who had a personal breakthrough and found the resolve it took to exchange 20 bullet wounds for 2 inches of progress. But because Giorno was there, he got to have his faith rewarded and live to enjoy his success, and become a part of the dream. This is what I love about Giorno. He's figured out who he is, and while he doesn't grow himself, this lets him support the big transformations of the people around him, and bring them into the fight for a better future. Mary Sue's and self-inserts are hated because they are associated with the author projecting an idealized vision of themselves into the story and focusing on self-gratification instead of captivating the audience. When Araki has Giorno be a bit too perfect, it's not to glorify Giorno, it's to enhance the big moments of the characters around him, and that's a role he serves beautifully. A lot of my affection for Giorno is like this. It's not just who he is, but what he represents. I almost view Giorno as Araki's statement that he had completely mastered JoJo as a series. When crafting the Part 5 protagonist, Araki looked for inspiration in the franchise's earliest material, which he had poured his heart into at a time when he really didn't have the skills to bring out the story's full potential. But when he put those ideas into practice, not only was Giorno the first JoJo to be drawn entirely in the new phase of Araki's style, but he broke every established convention of the series, being a contested member of the family who was largely pursuing his own goals in isolation from the established Joestar network. His gang affiliation and relationship to Dio only push him further out of the norm. Also, it seems important that Vento Aureo contains all these bold decisions while being set in Italy, a culture which Araki seems to deeply respect as a source of artistic inspiration, though I could be reading too far into that. It's like Giorno's story is the capstone to the long epic which began with Phantom Blood, tying up the emotional loose ends from earlier parts while also letting Araki flex his creative muscles in preparation for the risks he would take in Stone Ocean. Obviously, the story has progressed far past this point, and some would argue I should be saying this about Part 6, but I think the classic era of JoJo really did end with Vento Aureo, with the part, and more specifically the character of Giorno, being a celebration of how much the series had accomplished through that point, and a send-off for a stage of Araki's career which had been wonderful but also ran its course. And I really could not have asked for anything better.